Green Book Study Notes. Examgram Workbook. Part 1. Property Estates and Ownership. 7. Estate and Remainder. 8. Community Property. Joint Tenancy. Tenancy in Common. 10. The 4 units of joint tenancy. T. Dip. Time, title, interest and possession. 12. Defeasible estate. Part 2. 3. Private restriction. Created deed or written agreement. 4. Enforceable because the location of the easement does not need to be specified. The existence of an easement is obvious and necessary at the time a property is conveyed even though no mention of it is made in the deed. 6. The personal, revocable, unassignable permission to use the property of another without a possessory interest in it is called a license. A license is a revocable permission to use that property that may not be transferred to anyone else. 8. A person who dies intestate will have the estate administered and distributed by a court automatically. 10. Real property transferred under the provisions of a will is called a devise. Real property inherited under the terms of a will is called a devise. Personal property is classed a legacy or bequest. A codicil is a change in the original will. 11. A deed in transfer. Real property must be delivered and accepted to be binding on a buyers and a seller. Property is acquired by transfer when, by an act of the parties or law titles conveyed, or transferred, from one person to another by means of a written document. A deed is binding when it is delivered and accepted. 12. The clause in a deed which sets forth the extent of the grantee's interest with the property is called the habendum clause. The habendum clause, the have and to hold clause, defines the extent of the estate being transferred. 13. Effective delivery of a deed depends on the intention of the grantor. It must be the intention of the grantor that the deed is delivered and title be transferred during his lifetime. 14. A general warranty deed has 5 covenants. They are season, quiet enjoyment, further assurance, warranty forever, against encumbrances. 15. Quiet title action is a court processing to clear a cloud on the title of real property. It is frequently used to clear tax titles, titles based on adverse possession, and the seller's title under a forfeited, recorded land contract. Unit 2. Board of Land Commissioners. Subdivision map. Good reference for legal description. Point of beginning used meet and bounds. Unit 4. Testator names executor. Accretion. Deposit on river bank. Reliction. Water recedes new shoreline. Effective deed signed by grantor. Unit 3. Life estate owner can sell only life estate. Joint tenants will be sole owner. Community property is all property acquired by spouse. Domestic partner that's not separate property. Concurrent ownership, tenancy partnership. Subrogate is to substitute one person in place of another. With reference to an obligation. Subordination clause. A clause in a contract in which the holder of a deed of trust permits a subsequent loan to take priority. Codicil. A testamentary disposition subsequent to a will, altering, explaining, adding, subtracting from, confirming it, but not revoking it. Devise. A gift of real property by will. Condemnation. A process by which the government acquires private property for public use under right of eminent domain. Habendum clause. Beginning with words, to have and to hold. Defines or limits ownership interest of grantee, included in warranty deed, but not in a grant deed. Estoppel is a legal doctrine which prevents a person from denying something to be true or a fact if denial is contrary to previous statements, or actions made by that same person. Accretion. A buildup of soil by natural causes on property, bordering a river, lake or ocean. Reliction is exposing of previously covered land by receding water. Economic rent. What a leased property would be expected to rent for under current market conditions, if property were vacant and available for rent. The 4 elements of value are stud, scarcity, transferability, utility, and demand. In a well-planned residential community, what contributes most to the maintenance of value? The answer is conformity to proper land use objectives. GRM. Divide the listed price by the gross income, to arrive at the multiplier. To calculate gross rent multiplier equals the annual rent and the selling price. Unearned increments refers to the increase in the value of a property due to a population influx. This increases the amount of goods and services available, and leads to additional infrastructure and overall growth. Market comparison is the approach uses the principle of substitution to compare similar properties, highest and best use, in determining the value on an improved parcel of land. The first thing to establish, vest, is to give an immediate fixed right to property. When declaring a homestead, it is not necessary to divulge the purchase price. Neither death of the homesteader nor destruction of the property terminates the homestead. To be valid, a homestead must be recorded. The declaration of homestead must be signed, acknowledged, and recorded to take effect. Negligence is the failure to exercise the care that a reasonably prudent person would exercise in like circumstances. In a legal sense, negligence is different from fraud in that it lacks intent. A real estate agent is fraudulent if they intentionally dupe or mislead a client. Legal impediment means a legal impediment preventing or restricting the transfer of a business asset or the assumption of a business liability, as the case may be, in the restructuring as of the distribution date. An anchor bolt is a heavy-duty fastener that's used to connect objects to concrete. Steel poles, for example, are often mounted onto concrete surfaces using anchor bolts. The anchor bolts are driven through the base of the pole and into the concrete itself. The footing is the concrete base below the frost line that supports the foundation of the structure. The mudsill, also called a sill plate, is the first layer of wood to be installed on top of the foundation wall. It serves as the anchor point for the home's framing. Ridgeboard, the highest horizontal member of a roof, running along the ridge, and receiving the rafters at right angles. Grandfather clause, a clause in a statute or zoning ordinance, particularly a city ordinance, which permits the operator of a business or a landowner to be exempt from restrictions on use if the business or property continues to be used as it was when the law was adopted. A non-conforming use is a legally established use of land which is not permitted in the zoning district in which it is located, or a use which is permitted by use permit but for which no use permit has been obtained, because the use was established prior to the application of the existing district due to rezoning. The effective gross income is the total annual income from the property minus any vacancy or rental losses. An appraiser valuing a property looks at the economic rent, rather than the contract rent, in order to discover the fair income of the property. Effective age is not determined by the actual age of a building but by its condition and usefulness. The gross rent multiplier is defined as sales value divided by gross rent. Divide the list price by the gross annual income. Surface water. California recognizes two sources of water: surface water and groundwater. Surface water is the water found on the land in watercourses, such as natural springs, streams, or rivers, and in bodies of water, such as ponds or lakes. The right to use any water controlled by the state rather than by the landowner adjacent to the water is called prior appropriation. The right to use any water, with the exception of limited domestic use, is controlled by the State of California Water Resources Control Board, rather than the landowner adjacent to the water, is called prior appropriation. In California, the use of community property and joint tenancies and the laws of descent and distribution have made it unnecessary to use dower and courtesy equal deals with inheritance of husband and wife from each other. Spot zoning is a small area zoned differently from the surrounding area is called spot zoning. Laches is the delay in asserting one's right is called laches. Laches is an unreasonable delay by a party making a claim or bringing an action, so that the right of said properties is waived. There is no statute of limitations. Ridgeboard is the highest structural part of a frame building. A gable roof has a pitched roof with two sloping sides. A gambrel roof typically seen in Dutch colonial architecture is curved roof with a steep lower slope with a flatter one above. A hip roof is a pitched roof with sloping sides and ends. All four sides. Corporations are taxed as a separate entity. Blockbusting or panic peddling is persuading an owner to sell or rent housing by saying that people of a particular race, religion are moving into the neighborhood. Redlining, the illegal use of a property location to deny financing or insurance. Sherman Antitrust Act is federal law to protect consumers from price fixing. Age is not required under the Fair Housing Act. Which of these would provide an investor with the best hedge against inflation? The answer is ownership of real property. Historically, real property has shown a consistent growth in value and remains the best hedge against inflation. By owning assets that rise in value with inflation, for example real estate, an investor can beat inflation. Some tax advantages from real estate investment are installment sales and tax-deferred exchanges. A declaration of homestead is the recorded document that protects a homeowner from foreclosure by certain judgment creditors. It can be filed after the filing of a court action but must be filed before the filing of a judgment. A declaration is not valid unless recorded prior to the filing of a court action. A contract to sell community real property must be signed by both spouses. If it is signed by only one, the contract cannot be enforced. Property vested as John Jones and its wife Mary, unless a presumption that title is vested a community property and either spouse may will his interest to whomever he chooses. However, if either spouse dies intestate, the surviving spouse would inherit the deceased spouse's interest without probate. A husband may lease real community property without his wife's consent for up to 1 year. If for more than 1 year, he must have his wife's consent. Both husband and wife have the right to will half the community property. If the purchaser has legal capacity, the sale is valid. In whom the title is vested does not affect the legality of the sale. The title could vest in a 3-year-old child. This is the end of the Green Notebook Part 1.